Hey everybody, this is Dan with TaDa Ministries, and I'm here with another game review. Now, the way we review games here is we'll take a look at how the game plays out, some of the different mechanics that set it apart from similar games within its genre, but then we'll talk about some of the different things about the game that make it a bit more appealing within the family context. What are some of the things that a family can learn or grow from to build different relationships and change dynamics within the family? So if you're looking for a new game, or if you already have this game in your collection, our hope is that you can find a new dimension or a new depth to it. The game we're going to be talking about today is Elemental Clash. Now, I drive a Honda Element, and the last thing I want to think about is Elemental Clash. But I guess the game has nothing to do with that at all. Actually, it's a fantasy-themed collectible card game. Excuse me, a living card game. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit. The game was created by a fellow named Andreas Probst, who is the same person that developed Panzer Clash. Now, you could probably guess from the name of the two games. They're very similar. And he sent me a copy of both games to review. Now, if you've already watched our Panzer Clash review, then a lot of the things we're going to talk about in Elemental Clash will be familiar. But the two games are definitely different enough and good enough to be considered legitimate games in their own right. I'm not going to be going through and comparing Elemental Clash and Panzer Clash to one another. They're certainly two distinct games and both worthy of a separate review. A game that I did not intend to compare Elemental Clash to, but probably will, is Magic the Gathering. Magic is really kind of the standard for fantasy-themed collectible card games. Really, it's the standard for any collectible card game in my mind. They are owned by Wizards of the Coast, extremely well funded, have a large team of illustrators, designers, and playtesters, and everything else. Elemental Clash and Panzer Clash, I guess for that matter, are both designed and taken care of by one person. He did the artwork, the concept, the design of the game. I didn't think that there was any way that Elemental Clash would be able to compare to a big dog like Magic the Gathering. But really, when you stack the two up next to each other, Elemental Clash has nothing to fear. It's a different game, and it's going to appeal to a very different group of people. We'll talk about that as we go along. So let's crack open this game of Elemental Clash and see how it works. This is a basic setup of a game of Elemental Clash. Both you and your opponent have a spellbook of exactly 40 cards. Now, this spellbook is going to contain the creatures and spells you're going to try to use to win the game, but it also doubles as a life counter. Once you run out of cards in your spellbook, you're going to lose the game pretty quickly, because if you can't draw a card but you need to, and you have to draw a card every turn, you lose the game. So if you can make your opponent run out of cards before you do, you win. Now, the basic way you're going to do that is by drawing these cards and playing them out in front of you to damage your opponent. Now, the only way that you can play different spells and creatures and that sort of thing is if you have the energy to do so. Energy comes from these different stones. Now, you didn't think this was called Elemental Clash for no reason, right? Because each element has its own stone. We've got the air element, which is purple. Everybody knows air is purple, right? That's pretty obvious. We've got fire, which is red. We've got earth, which is green. And water is blue. And then we have some colorless, quote-unquote, colorless neutral energy stones that'll produce energy, but it's not of a particular color yet. You can have up to 5 different piles of energy stones. And each pile can produce up to 1 card per turn if they can afford it. Now, the different cards you're going to play, spells and creatures and so on, are going to have 2 different things about them. They'll have a color and they'll have a cost. Now, the color is going to be keyed to one of these 4. So a card might be an air card, for example, or maybe it'll be part of the fire elemental. And then it'll have a cost in energy stones. It might only cost 1, it might cost 2, or it might cost 3. Now, I'm using the standard starter decks, I guess. Everything you see here is part of the standard starter pack, and everything has a cost between 1 and 3. Later expansions might have cards that cost more. I'm really not sure. So if you have a card that's purple and only has a cost of 1, you could play it on this pile right here, because here we have 1 purple element stone. Now, the way you would play out more expensive cards is by stacking these guys up. And the way they stack is a little bit peculiar. You have to pay attention to what stone is on the bottom, or at least what colored stone is on the bottom. For example, if I were to take this fire stone and put it on top of the air one, I now have an element stone pile that produces 2 energy, because there's 2 stones, but it produces only water energy. Excuse me, air energy, because air is on the bottom of this pile. Whatever the lowest most colored element stone is the color that that entire pile produces. So this guy would produce up to 2 air energy for me. Now if I took say I had a neutral card on the bottom of my pile, and then a water on top of that, and then an earth on top of that, this pile is now going to produce up to 3 water energy, because we ignore the neutral since it's colorless. So the bottommost colored element stone is water, and we have 3 element stones in the pile, so we could produce any card that had costed 3 and required water. An example of such a card would be this guy, a Mercury Shatterer, or a lobster with a hammer. Here you can see that he's a water creature, because he's blue. We can see that he has a cost of 3, and we can see some other information about him, like he has an attack of 2, a defense of 4, and when he comes into play, your opponent has to take one of their element stones and put it back into their hand. Haha. You can only play 1 element stone per turn, so that would just slow down their production. So if I had this card in my hand, I could go ahead and set it down on top of this element stone pile, because it produces 3 energy, and it produces blue energy. So now this card is in play. That's how playing cards works. Pretty straightforward. Now once your turn begins, you'll have a standby phase. Any element stone pile that still has a spell on it, or a creature on it, is going to have something happen to kind of clear those out. So if we just had a basic spell sitting on top of one of these element stone piles, they would go to your discard pile, called your archive. So if we had something sitting on here, we would just go ahead and discard that. If you have a creature, you can choose where to put that creature. You have 2 different zones to place them in. You have a defensive zone, which can hold up to 5 creatures, and you have an attack zone, which can hold up to 5 creatures. If you have a creature in your defensive zone, like I'll put this guy up here, now if my opponent chooses to attack me with a creature, he can block. Now if I don't have anybody in my defensive zone and my opponent attacks me with a creature, all the damage that he deals would be done directly to my spellbook. But because I now have somebody in my defensive zone, I could choose to block with him if I wanted to. That's the purpose of putting him there. If I put him in my attack zone, he can no longer block my spellbook. So if my opponent chooses to attack my spellbook, I have no defense. He's just going to come right in and hit me. But I can choose to attack my opponent with this guy. So now let's say that my opponent has no way of blocking him or chooses not to, and I attack with my Mercury Shatterer here. He has an attack of 2, that's his red value, so my opponent would simply take 2 cards right off the top. And that's how the game works. You're constantly dealing damage back and forth to the other player's spellbook, or perhaps attempting to deal damage but blocking it with the defender, and just removing cards from your spellbook and your opponent's spellbook until somebody can't draw a card, at which point they lose the game. That's the basic play of Elemental Clash. So now that you've seen how the cards sit on the table and interact with each other, what did I think? I actually like it quite a bit for what it is. It's a fantasy-based card game. It's quick and dirty. You can get the cards on the table, you play it out fairly quickly. You're always damaging yourself by drawing cards every turn, so you don't get into this stalemate situation that other games offer. Every round you're drawing a card, so you're getting that much closer to the end of the game, even if you aren't doing anything with your cards. The cards have a very close price gap, from 1 to 3, so you're going to be putting out a lot of cards, and you're going to be getting rid of your opponent's cards fairly quickly. So you're really rewarded for actually doing something with your cards instead of building up. Plus you're only allowed to have 5 attackers and 5 defenders at a time, so you can't really build up a massive army. When you play out a card, you want to use it. And when your opponent plays out a card, you'll probably be able to get rid of it relatively quickly. It's a fast-paced game. It also has a really low barrier to entry. It's straightforward. You can read on the text or on the cards what exactly they do, and for the most part, they make perfect sense. It's not like other games that need rules, tons and tons and tons of rules, and then explanations of the rules, and then explanations of how to interpret the explanations of the rules, and so on, like other games like I don't know, Magic the Gathering, for example. You can sit down with Elemental Clash knowing very little about the game, peruse the rule book a little bit, and get playing. It's that sort of a game. The other thing I really like about it is the cost. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this review that this is a living card game as opposed to a collectible card game. Now, the designer makes that distinction because this game offers static booster packs. Now what that means is when you want to go and buy more cards for your deck because you want to swap out different cards and tweak it and make it your own, you can do that. But when you buy those cards, you know exactly what you're going to get. So if you buy the Earth booster pack, for example, you'll get 3 copies of every Earth card. Every Earth card. A lot of other games will have random booster packs. And what that means is you go and buy a pack, you pay your however much money you pay, and you get a bunch of random cards. Now you might get cards you want, you might get cards you don't want. Who knows? You could get random cards. Obviously the static route is a lot less expensive. I like that feature about this game. I had a lot of Magic the Gathering cards I didn't use for 3 years. And then I kind of brushed the dust off and looked at them and looked at what was going on the scene and realized I was so out of date that I had to really just start over. But it was so expensive to start over, I just didn't bother. I moved on to other things. I no longer have a Magic card to my soul. So the end result with Elemental Clash is it's easier to get into, it's less expensive to get into, and really for the casual gamer, I think it's more fun because it's more straightforward and there's less things going on at once that you have to deal with. Now, as far as family friendliness, I don't think it brings a whole lot to the table on its own. Now, if you bring something to the table, this definitely gives the opportunity for just spending time with family, enjoying each other, laughing, having a good social event. Now, if you have someone who's very competitive in your family or in your group, you may either want to give this game a skip for a little while or use it as an opportunity to teach a good lesson. Competitive games like Elemental Clash are great for showing somebody that, you know what, you don't always get to win because there are other people with good skills and abilities out there, and, you know, when they wind up on top, how do you deal with that? How do you handle it when someone else wins? Also, how do you handle it when you win? How do you handle that gracefully? Games are a great way to learn those sorts of lessons that are going to apply and really matter later on in life. So Elemental Clash, as any competitive game would, offers the opportunity to learn those lessons. And that's Elemental Clash. Hopefully you found out some things about the game, may be interested in learning some more. Go ahead and look up Elemental Clash on thegamecrafter.com, or I believe they have their own website of elementalclash.com. Either way, hopefully you enjoyed the review, and we'll see you next time.